Hello all out there in YouTube, and welcome to another episode of Horror Talk, where you watch some guy on YouTube ramble on about a subject that he's passionate about. Very novel concept, I know. Anyway, as you can see from the title of this video, we're going to be talking about horror comedies. This idea was suggested by one of my subscribers, Wim van der Strauten. He made a comment saying, hey, you know, it would be a good idea for a horror talk. Why don't you talk about horror comedies? And I like that idea. I mean, because I enjoy horror comedies, and there are plenty of people who enjoy a good horror comedy. I wasn't originally going to do it for this episode of Horror Talk, though. I was going to put it on hold for now and talk about some other ideas that I had, or other subjects that I wanted to talk about. However, as many people know, things have been a little crazy out there, and it's been some weird times we've been living in, so I thought, you know what? I think we could all talk about some horror comedy right now. I think we deserve to talk about stuff that makes us laugh. So I thought, hey, you know what? No, this is the perfect time to do it. People say laughter is the best medicine, and that's very true. As big of a horror fan as I am, and as much as I love the horror genre and exploitation films and grindhouse cinema and B-movies, I've always thought the most important thing for me is my sense of humor. That's how I deal with reality, is being able to joke about it, being able to laugh at it. Whenever things are crazy in the world, I think the best thing to do is find a way to laugh at it. So yeah, I've always thought that, yes, laughter is the best medicine, but sometimes laughter can be the best weapon. If bad shit is happening, if you are able to laugh at it and able to joke about it, that's a way to combat it. It takes its power away a little bit. So I thought, hey, that idea, we'll talk about horror comedy. So thank you, Wim van der Strauten, for that suggestion. So this one's for you, buddy, and everybody out there who just needs a little escape from reality. Before we get into talking about horror comedies, let's focus on the two separate genres here for a second, you know, horror and comedy. Because when you look at these two genres, you'll notice that they have quite a bit in common. You look at comedies. One important aspect of comedy is timing. You know, you have to time whatever joke or humorous situation you have outright and get a good punchline in at the right moment. You know, it's like setup, payoff. That is a huge part of comedy, whether it's telling a joke, stand-up comedy, or a comedy film. Setup, payoff. It's very important in comedy, and that's also important in horror. Instead of setting up a joke or setting up some kind of humorous moment, you're setting up the scare, whether that be a jump scare, a gore scene, or just, you know, building the tension to this big moment. You know, set up a joke, make the punchline. For a horror movie, set up the scare, have the scary thing happen. So timing can be very important there, and also what can be important is ending the joke at the right time, or ending the scare at the right time. Because you'll notice this in bad comedies. Whenever they're doing a joke for too long and they're playing off a gag for too long, it stops being funny. You know, like initially you're like, this is funny, but then they play that for too long, and then it's not funny anymore. Same thing with horror, you know, it's like a scene can be scary, but if you don't end that scene at the right time, you don't know when to, you know, stop whatever the scary thing is, it's no longer scary anymore. That's the whole thing with a lot of horror and a lot of comedy. If everything's funny, nothing's funny. If everything's scary, nothing's scary. So that's one of the things that you notice when you look at these two genres. Laughter can be part of both comedy and horror, when you think about it. Like, of course, naturally with comedy, you know, something funny happens, you laugh. But, like, when you're watching a horror movie, you'll notice this especially with, like, a group of people, or if you're in a movie theater. Remember those? Hopefully, I hope we get back to those soon, but hey, we'll see what happens. But anyway, watching a horror movie with a group of people, when something so horrible happens on the screen, sometimes you'll see people, they'll react, and then they'll follow that reaction up with a laugh. You know, like, you'll see something so gory and grotesque, and you'll go like, oh. You'll notice that when watching a lot of horror movies, especially with a group of people. You come up with a laugh as sort of a defense mechanism to deal with the horror on screen. I've noticed that because I used to have a lot of movie nights with my friends, and I'd show them something, and sometimes I'd show them, like, something fun, sometimes I'd show them something, and then the disturbing thing would happen, and they'd be like, oh god, it's so horrible. They'd be laughing, even though they're disturbed. So yeah, laughter can be a defense mechanism. So you can see laughter being part of both horror and comedy. But the main thing that comedy and horror have in common is misery. Hear me out with this, okay? Naturally in horror, you're going to come across some form of misery, some form of hardship, some form of, you know, something terrible happening to the characters. You know, like, naturally, okay, people being killed in a slasher movie, or somebody being possessed, or haunted by ghosts, or that whole thing. Then you look at comedy, and you'll see that in the majority of comedies, I won't say all comedies, but in the majority of comedies, misery walks hand in hand with the humor. Think of slapstick. First of all, to start with, slapstick is probably one of the most notorious elements of comedy. Naturally, okay, it's like people getting hurt and that's amusing. Or, you know, like, some ridiculous situation where, you know, like, the straight man gets frustrated with the comedic edge or something like that. You look at one of the most classic comedic sketches, it's, you know, Who's on First with Abbott and Costello. What's funny about that? You have this guy, Costello, talking to his friend Abbott, and the joke is, okay, who's on first, what's on second, I don't know who's on third. That's the name of the characters, and what's making it funny is seeing Costello getting so frustrated because he doesn't get this whole thing, and it's his frustration that makes the scenario so funny. You look at, like, the old Tom and Jerry cartoons where, you know, like, you see these horrible things happening to this cat and constantly getting hurt time and time again, and it's funny. But you look at, like, the 90s gross-out comedies, like American Pie, like, you know, you're seeing some guy, you know, hearing that, oh, sex is like warm apple pie, so he is having sex with a pie and his dad walks in. Boom, misery. The embarrassment of that situation. So yeah, so a lot of comedy revolves around some form of misery, which is the same with horror. So these genres have this kind of thing in common. It makes plenty of sense to mix these genres together. And you see a lot of mixing of different genres with horror. You know, there's, like, romantic horror, or there's action horror, you know, things like that. But you look at it, especially back in the 80s, there are so many horror comedies, you know, a blend of those particular genres, and because, again, the misery, that element of misery connects these two genres, so it makes a lot of sense to combine these two. Getting into the topic of horror comedies now, focusing on horror comedy now, I've always viewed horror movie in 3 different categories. In the middle here, you have horror movies that are enjoyed because they're just good horror movies. They're good, they're scary, they're suspenseful. The fun from these movies is the fact that you're scared. You know, it mixes, you know, like, a good amount of gore, a good amount of atmosphere, a good amount of tension, a good amount of creepy moments. That's what is enjoyable about those movies. These are movies like The Shining, or Candyman, or Alien. Then over here you have those horror movies that are effective because they're disturbing. They make you feel depressed for watching them. They just give you that bad feeling in the pit of your stomach. It makes you feel like your throat drops into your stomach. You know, movies like Cannibal Holocaust, I Spit on Your Grave, Last House on the Left, things like that. And then you have the final category, which is horror movies that aren't focused on being scary, they're just focused on being fun. You're just giving you an entertaining ride. Yes, they are horror movies, and they have elements of horror movies, but they're mostly just about being entertaining. And that's where you find most horror comedies, like, you know, Evil Dead 2, and Re-Animator, which you see back here, and Return of the Living Dead. So yeah, you have these three different categories, and then, you know, you're always in a mood for particular ones. Like, the one over here, the disturbing category, you have to be in the right frame of mind for that one. And you can always enjoy a good scary movie, but the fun category can be the most appealing at times. You know, after a long day of work or whatever, you want to just sit down and watch a movie, you're going to go for the fun category. If you're a horror fan, you want to watch a horror movie, you might go for the scary one, but after a long, hard day of work, you're going to go for the fun category. It's just like, I just want to have a good time watching a movie. I am a fan of horror comedies, you know, like, when I was first becoming a horror fan, I think everybody, when they're first becoming a horror fan, when you're young and becoming a horror fan, you have that moment of pretension. You have that moment of, like, wanting to prove that you're a true horror fan. This is mostly, like, middle school, maybe going into high school. But, you know, it's just like, oh yeah, only scary movies are good horror movies. Like, you know, only slasher movies count as horror movies. Or, you know, like, I only want something like The Shining. I only want Alfred Hitchcock. You know, everybody, when they first get into horror movies, goes through that phase, I think, where they kind of look down on the sillier side of horror because they want to show that, yeah, like, I'm a hardcore horror fan, and it's mostly when you're young. But I think as people start getting older, and they start getting into the genre more, I think people get through that pretentious phase really quickly when they realize how fun horror movies can be, and then they start embracing the goofier side of horror. Because I've noticed a lot of people, when they first start getting into horror comedies are never their favorite genre when they start out, when they're relatively new to the genre. The most common genre that people go to as their favorite genre when they're still relatively new to horror movies is the slasher genre. You know, I mean, because you look at the slasher genre, and I'll get into more of this in another video, but the slasher genre was always that genre that was forbidden. You know, you had critics and movie snobs talking down about putting down slasher movies. Parents were just like, oh no, you cannot watch these movies, and adults said, hey, you're not allowed to see these slasher movies, and that just made them more appealing to new horror fans, especially teenagers, because it's like, slasher movies were the forbidden fruit. Horror comedies, like, usually the first horror comedy that people get into is Gremlins. That's usually, when it comes to horror comedies, that's the most notorious one, because it's rated PG-13. That's the one that a lot of parents and stuff wouldn't, like, when you're getting into horror, it's not one that you wouldn't mind your kid seeing. You know, like, that wasn't as forbidden as some of the other stuff, because it's rated PG-13. And, you know, people watch that, and they're like, yeah, that's fun, but it's a little cute. I mean, I want horror. But then, as they start watching more movies, they get introduced to more horror comedies, and they see that they can be pretty hardcore when they want to be. You know, something like Re-Animator or Return of the Living Dead. But yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, I love Gremlins, and I know a lot of people who love Gremlins, and it's earned a very wide fan base, and rightfully so. But it's just like when someone's first getting into horror and they want to, you know, they feel like they have to prove that they're a hardcore horror fan. They kind of look down on horror comedies until they open themselves up to the genre a lot more and see how vast the horror genre can really be. With horror comedies, there are two types of horror comedies. You have the ones that are clearly comedies. They focus more on the comedy than anything else. Yes, it has those tropes and elements of horror movies, but it's first and foremost a comedy. And then you have the horror comedies that they have funny moments and they have humor mixed in, but you can tell that horror is the point of it. Being a horror movie is what they're trying to do. They're trying to give you some laughs, but they're also trying to give you some creepy, suspenseful moments. Again, Gremlins would be a perfect example of that. There are some pretty suspenseful scenes in Gremlins. It gets more out of control as the movie goes along, and then when you see the Gremlins all in the bar having a party, this really chaotic party, you're having a good time. You're having a good time with the monsters. But when we first start out the movie, you have that whole scene in the house with the mother fighting back against the Gremlins, and it's pretty suspenseful when you look at it. But for me, okay, perfect example of these two sides of horror comedies. Like on this side, Tucker and Dale versus Evil is clearly a spoof of, those backwoods redneck horror movies, or in slasher movies and stuff like that. Movies like Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Wrong Turn, things along that line. It's clearly a comedy first. It's like using gore for gags. If you haven't seen Tucker and Dale versus Evil, it's very funny. You have these two guys in the woods. They're fixing up a cabin in the woods. Their names are Tucker and Dale, and they're actually nice guys. They look like they first come across before we're actually introduced to them, and we're just seeing them kind of at a distance. It's set up that they're creepy backwoods hillbillies. But then we follow them and we realize they're nice guys. And the whole thing with Tucker and Dale versus Evil is there's a group of college kids camping out near where their cabin is. And there's this one girl, she everybody goes skinny dipping, and then this one girl falls in the water and is knocked unconscious, and Tucker and Dale save her, but then the rest of the friends, mistake Tucker and Dale for backwoods hillbilly psychopaths. They think they kidnapped their friend, and due to all this misunderstanding, they're trying to save their friends, and they're accidentally killing each other off. They're accidentally killing themselves as they're trying to save their friend from Tucker and Dale, who are actually nice guys. And it's really funny, and it's, really bloody scenes, but it's splat stick, where the gore is part of the gags and stuff like that. But that one is mostly comedy. It might have maybe one creepy moment, but it's not trying to be scary in parts. It's trying to make you laugh. And then on this side, I think a good example of a horror comedy that's funny, but it's also trying to be scary, is Return of the Living Dead. You watch Return of the Living Dead, it's a very fun movie, you're having a good time, but there is a darkness to that movie that is... You watch it, you think, some of this stuff is kind of fucked up. In a good way, in the way that we horror fans love. Return of the Living Dead is a movie I always go back to when thinking of my favorite zombie movies. Growing up as a horror fan, in my early years, I would go with the George Romero movies, Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead. I would say Day of the Dead was my favorite. Getting older... I would have said Dawn of the Dead was my favorite. But as I've gotten older, of the three original George Romero movies, I'm starting to lean more towards Day of the Dead. Because I used to be a huge zombie fan. I loved zombie movies until we started getting so much zombie-related material. And I've said this before, with the bombardment of zombie movies, I've gotten zombied out, and I've kind of become sick of the genre. still love the movies that I loved when I was younger, but growing up, like, the zombie movies that I like the most are the ones that feel different from the other zombie movies, and Return of the Living Dead is one of those zombie movies. I've been debating for a while if that's my favorite zombie movie, or if it would be, like, the four zombie movies that I'm debating on which ones are my favorite are Re-Animator, Return of the Living Dead, Lucio Fulci's Zombie, and Day of the Dead by George Romero. And I have a hard time picking between those four, but I lean towards Re-Animator and Return of the Living Dead, even though Re-Animator's more of a mad scientist movie, but it does have zombie elements. I would say probably Re-Animator is my favorite of the four, but I have a hard time considering that a zombie movie. Anyway, I'm getting off topic here. But when you look at Return of the Living Dead, it's so different from other zombie movies, and it's funny. It has its funny moments. Like, for example, quick rundown of the whole idea. The zombies here are... I won't go into too many details, but bottom line, these zombies are not the Romero zombies. Like, the Romero zombies are slow, they, are mindless, they're just pure instinct coming at you, then they eat people. And you can only kill them by destroying the brain. The Return of the Living Dead zombies are completely different. They're intelligent, they can speak, they use tools, they run, they can set traps. People complain about, fast zombies, but fast zombies have existed for a while. That's a topic for another time. But bottom line, so these zombies, they eat brains. And they can't be killed by destroying the brain. Whatever this thing is that reanimates them, it's in their nerves, which you can't... The only way you can destroy them is by burning the bodies until they're ashes, which leads to some very humorous moments. Like, you have... And the movie's filled with ridiculous, over-the-top, humorous moments, like the scene where the character Trash, played by Linnea Quigley, has this striptease in the cemetery. Or there's a scene... these paramedics have come in, and they get attacked by the zombies. And the zombies, like, eating the paramedics' brains, and they start hearing the radio calling the paramedics. The zombie picks up the phone and says, "Dispatch, send more paramedics." That's funny. But it also has some legitimately creepy moments. Like when we're first introduced to the Tar Man. Again, I'm not going into too many details, but there's this one zombie, like the first of all these zombies. It's known as the Tar Man, and its skin is his skin is all melted off. So you have this skeleton with all this like black, slimy skin hanging off of him, and it's creepy. It has this really good kill where he's like yells brains, because all these zombies are hungry for brains, and like he just yells brains and he'll grab somebody and then bite their skull open and start eating their brains. It's a legitimately tense moment. It's very well done. The scene where Trash gets killed, she gets swarmed by all these zombies, and yeah, it's a pretty frightening moment. So, yeah, you have movies like Re-Animator, where, like Return of the Living Dead, where you have your funny moments, but then you have your scary moments. It's that balance. Like, this is a horror movie with funny moments. And you have plenty of horror movies that have humor. Like, Jaws is a great horror movie, because I think it has some good scary moments, but the characters, are fun, too, so... But I can't really call Jaws a horror comedy. Like, horror comedies is like, it's either mostly a comedy, or it's a balance between horror and comedy. Like, horror is the point of it, but it has plenty of funny moments. Then you have your horror comedies that are funny because of how ludicrous the situation is, and how self-aware the movie is of its ridiculous situation. And you can see it back there. One of the best examples of this is Killer Klowns from Outer Space. Again, you just look at the title, you get how ridiculous the premise is. clowns that come from outer space and kill people. But it's not just like that. It's, you know, like, it's a very clown-esque way. Like, if you were to picture alien clowns, how alien clowns would kill people, yeah, these alien clowns kill people in very clown-esque ways. That's why, for me, if I'm to pick the best, like, clown horror movie, it's Killer Klowns from Outer Space. It is. I mean, Pennywise can suck it. On second thought, maybe Pennywise shouldn't suck it. I've seen those teeth, so might not be a good idea for Pennywise to suck it. But anyway, the characters are fun. I mean, you have these fun characters, but they are normal people. And then you have this ridiculous situation come to them. This ridiculous threat comes to them, and they're treating it like it's a legitimate threat. You know, as silly as this idea is, these people believe that these clowns are a threat. It's a good balance of silly and threatening. The whole movie is silly, but they do a good job at making these clowns seem like they're threatening. And the reason why these are my favorite killer clowns in horror movies is because they are clowns. One thing that bugs me is when a horror movie has an antagonist that is a specific thing, but that never comes into play in the movie. Let me see if I can try to explain this better. You look at the new It movies, and I do like It Chapter 1. I thought It Chapter 2 sucked. I'm sorry, but I did not like that. But looking at the new It movies, they're good. I mean, It Chapter 1, it's good. But there doesn't seem to be any reason for Pennywise to be a clown. He has balloons and stuff like that, but all he really does that's clown-like is he has the balloons and he does his silly dance. And it's like, if you're gonna make your killer a clown, have that be a part of his character. You look at the clowns from Killer Klowns from Outer Space, they are clowns. They kill people by shooting these lasers at them that encase them in cotton candy cocoons. They have popcorn guns that they shoot at people. You know, it's just like, everything about them is clown-esque. You can tell these are clowns. They're clown-like monsters. But again, the fact that they are clowns is actually used in the movie. Pennywise being a clown, it's used to an extent in the It movies, but they never take full advantage of the fact that he's a clown. It seems to be the fact that Pennywise is a clown, I wouldn't even say comes second, it seems to come third. That's what it is. It's just like he's scary first, he contorts himself and does that weird thing second, and then third, oh yeah, that's right, he is a clown. It's like when I see killer clowns in horror movies, I want them to be clowns. I want the fact that they're clowns to be a part of the horror, part of the kills, part of the whole scenario. That's just me. I know other people are fine with that. There are a lot of people who like Pennywise, and I like him to an extent, but he's not one of my favorite horror villains. Like, I will put the Killer Klowns from Outer Space over Pennywise any day of the week. That's just me. Anybody who likes Pennywise, you're free to like Pennywise. But yeah, the main thing I like about Killer Klowns from Outer Space is the fact that the villains are clowns, and the movie treats them like evil clowns. And that's honestly one of the reasons why it's one of the best horror comedies, because of you have this ridiculous situation, and they take full advantage of the ridiculous situation. And going back to, I want to mention this about Killer Klowns, going back to the idea of having legitimately creepy moments in your horror comedies, Killer Klowns is, for the most part, a comedy, but it does have, like, a moment in there that is legitimately creepy. It's PG-13, so it never gets too violent, but it does have moments that are kind of grotesque. Like, the scene that comes to mind is the scene in the jail. It's going to be slight spoilers here. You have this one cop in the film, Officer Mooney, that's what he's known as, and he's played by that guy, I can't think of his name off the top of my head, but he's always the stick in the mud in every movie, whether it's a comedy or whatever, he's the stick in the mud character. And there's a scene where, like, he doesn't believe that there are clowns out there. He thinks everyone's out to get him, and everyone's playing a prank on him, until one of the clowns actually comes to the jail. Won't get into details, but through shenanigans, Mooney ends up getting killed. And then you have one of the main characters come back to the police station, and it's actually, as silly as this movie is, it's actually a pretty atmospheric scene. Like, he walks into the jail cell, he sees these clown footprints, and then he starts seeing the clown footprints all over the walls and ceiling and stuff like that, which is silly, but it also kind of adds to the atmosphere of this scene. He goes to the jail cells, and he sees some of the cotton candy cocoons in there. And there's like a scene where an arm falls out of, or slips out of one of the cocoons. And again, it has that creepy atmosphere. It has a creepy horror atmosphere in this very silly movie. And here's the spoiler here. The clown, the character eventually sees the clown with Officer Mooney, and he's using him as a ventriloquist dummy. And that idea sounds silly, but the way they handle it here is actually kind of creepy. Like, they have, like, this one scene in Killer Klowns from Outer Space, it's my favorite scene in the movie, and as funny as the rest of the movie is, and as much as I enjoy the rest of the movie for how silly it is, this one scene here actually does have some legitimate atmosphere. Like, seeing this clown use this police officer, as a ventriloquist dummy, it kind of reminded me of the scene in Independence Day. You remember in Area 51 where the alien killed all the doctors, and now he's holding up one of the doctors and using the doctor to speak for him? It's very similar in Killer Klowns from Outer Space. I don't think this is the case, but it's fun to think that Killer Klowns inspired Independence Day. But anyway, it's a very similar scene. Like, the clown is using the dummy and is talking through the dead body that he's using it as a dummy. And what solidifies this moment for me, and again, PG-13 horror movie, the clown takes his hand out of the dead body's back, and it's covered with blood, and he just shakes off the blood and lets the body fall to the floor. And it's funny, but it's also kind of grotesque when you think about it. Another example of a good horror comedy that I love that takes advantage of its ridiculous premise, one of my favorite horror comedies is The Stuff. I absolutely love The Stuff. I know there are people out there who do not like that movie, but I can't help it. I absolutely love The Stuff. Just because of the premise, again, it's silly, but they do it right. It's literally a killer dessert movie. It's like, for those who have not seen The Stuff, he's like, you have these miners, and as they're mining, this stuff, white stuff, bubbles up from the ground, and of course the first thing they do is, hey, let's give that a taste. And they find out that it tastes really good. Flash forward a few years after, and this substance that bubbled up out of the earth is now The Stuff, which is the new hit dessert sweeping the nation, and it's very addictive and everybody loves it. And then you find out that this stuff is actually a living organism that wants people to eat it so it can take over your body. I love that idea. I love that idea, and again, they take full advantage of this ridiculous, silly premise. And for me, that just makes the movie so much more enjoyable. And it's fun because it's like, it is a comedy, and it has some elements of body horror that I love. Because I'm a big fan of body horror, and seeing it used in a comedic way is just very, very entertaining to me. But yeah, it's like, there are times where, yes, being a straightforward comedy, but with horror elements, there's time where that works, and there's time where having horror be the point of your movie also works. It's a delicate balance that you have to find. Some of the best horror comedies came from the 80s. You have some great horror comedies now, like I mentioned, Tucker and Dale versus Evil, and then there's Black Sheep, which I reviewed recently. Hey, me shamelessly whoring myself out. Black Sheep is another example of having your ridiculous villain or antagonist and treating that like a legitimate threat. Having the characters treat this silly villain like a legitimate threat. Black Sheep, very simple, takes place in New Zealand, and it involves genetically altered killer sheep. Ridiculous, I know. But they have fun with the idea, they take full advantage of it, and the humans take the threat very seriously. The characters can be silly in a horror comedy. There's nothing wrong with the, protagonists or the human characters being silly. But they can never be sillier than the antagonist. Sometimes what makes a horror comedy so funny is the fact that the villain is so ridiculous, and the villain has to be the most ridiculous part of the movie. Like I said, it's nothing wrong with the characters being silly, but they should never be sillier than the ridiculous villain. Re-Animator, which I absolutely love, there's the famous scene where, spoiler alert again if you haven't seen it, where a severed head gives head to a woman. Not really. I mean, it's like, having a scene like that in a horror movie where there is some kind of sexual violence going on, that can be hard to do. I'm one of those people that thinks you can make anything funny. It's all about context. You can make a joke about anything as long as you have the right context for it, and you put it in the right context. And Re-Animator, in that famous scene, it is the most famous scene in the movie, the severed head gives head. The scene comes off as ridiculous, of course, because, again, it's a severed head mouthing a woman's body. But the actress Barbara Crampton does such a good job at selling it. Like, the scene doesn't feel awkward. We're usually in low-budget B-movies, whenever there is some kind of sexual violence, it comes across as awkward, like they're putting it in there just for the sake of getting nudity in there. But in Re-Animator, in this silly movie, they have this scene, and it feels legitimately intense because of Barbara Crampton's acting. But the whole thing is like, okay, people picture this thing, oh, this severed head gives the woman head. But here's the thing, in actuality, that doesn't really happen. It almost happens, and then they find the right moment to stop. The character Herbert West comes in, and the scene stops before it crosses that line. And, that's, again, that balance that you need to find in horror comedies. If they did go there, the scene wouldn't be as fun. But because they stopped it at the right time, it's still a fun movie. It's just like, there's a way to handle scenes like that in your horror movies and in horror comedies. Like I said, from the beginning, it's important to know when to stop the joke or when to stop the scare. And the severed head giving head scene is a perfect example of taking the joke and the scare just far enough. It's like, we're gonna go far in this, we're gonna cross a line here, but we're not gonna take you too far over that line. We're never gonna go so far past that line where the movie stops being fun. And I applaud Re-Animator for that. I mean, the fact that Re-Animator does that makes it, for me, one of the best horror comedies. Just to mention a couple other horror comedies that I love, we'll wrap this video up in a minute, but I wanted to mention a couple other horror comedies that I genuinely love. The Basket Case series, Frank Henenlotter, I think, is a severely underrated director. The original Basket Case is so cheaply made and so wonderfully done. You had this guy who just decided to make this movie on a whim, and watch the there's a documentary for the Basket Case series. Watch that. It'll give you so much more appreciation for not only the original Basket Case, but the Basket Case trilogy. And of course, Frankenhooker, also done by Frank Henenlotter, is fantastic. I love that movie so much. Going back to the Basket Case trilogy, that's one of my favorite horror franchises. Mostly because of Basket Case and Basket Case 2. I said this in my review for the Basket Case movies. I love how Basket Case 2 is so different from the original Basket Case. As much as I love other horror franchises, a lot of the sequels just feel like doing the first one again. It's like the Friday the 13th movies feel like the first like they're doing the first Friday the 13th again. The Halloween sequels feel like they're just doing the first Halloween again, excluding Halloween 3, and so on and so forth. But Basket Case 2 is so different from the first Basket Case, and they are legitimately funny in some moments, and I like how Frank Henenlotter took on these movies with the intent of not taking them seriously. That's why Frank Henenlotter is one of my favorite directors. Highly recommend checking out the Basket Case series. Highly recommend checking out Frankenhooker, also by Frank Henenlotter. Frankenhooker. But yeah, definitely would recommend the Basket Case trilogy. Definitely would recommend Frankenhooker. Like I said, all the movies you see behind me, if you haven't seen them, I would highly recommend them as horror comedies. But that's pretty much all the thoughts I have on horror comedies. I do love the genre. Once you get into horror comedies, it's a genre that's hard not to enjoy. Just because, taking comedy and taking horror and mixing them together, it's kind of a perfect marriage in some cases. And as much as I love, The Shining, or Maniac, or, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and things like that, sometimes you just want to have fun. And sometimes watching horrible things in very humorous ways can be a lot of fun. Schadenfreude, the German expression, finding amusement in other people's misery. That's essentially what comedy is in many ways. Comedy, in many cases, can be Schadenfreude. And horror comedy is the perfect example of Schadenfreude. So, I'd like to end this video, seeing as this is a video about laughing and putting a smile on people's faces, I wanted to end it with one of my favorite jokes. This is a joke that always made me laugh, and it's made my friends laugh. It's crude, it's kind of childish, but I've always found enjoyment with it. Kid goes up to his mother and asks, "Mommy, where do babies come from?" His mother says, "Well, the stork brings them, honey." And then the kid asks, "But who fucks the stork?" Well, anyway, on that note, as always, I want to thank everybody for watching. I'm glad you continue to enjoy the videos, and thank you all for continuing to support this channel. Leave a comment down below, and let me know some of your favorite horror comedies. Also, I have a few other ideas for horror talk that I want to do. I'd love to talk about slasher movies. I'd love to talk about many different topics. I came up with this fun idea for a topic. Let me know if you guys would like me to do this. Horror villains that could beat Superman. Before anybody freaks out, I know that no one is ever going to beat Superman. I mean, he's a very popular character, and there's no way anybody is going to make a scenario where Superman loses. But I thought it would be fun to talk about some horror characters that could defeat Superman, and that could make for an interesting crossover. I'll admit I'm not a big superhero guy. I'm not that familiar with it. I'm just kind of familiar with Superman and Batman and stuff like that, just because I grew up with some Superman stuff, and some Batman stuff, but I'm not a big superhero person, so I'm not that familiar with it. But let me know if you'd like me to do a horror talk on that, because I think that could be fun. So, on that note, again, thank you all for watching, and this is the Maniac, here to remind you that the Grindhouse will never die.